Okay. Good morning, everyone, and it's so good to have everyone here for our DE&I webinar, committee webinar sponsoring the appraisal bias overview. And we know that this has become a very, very important topic in our industry of late. It's been getting a lot of news press. It's got the attention of the Biden administration back in Washington. It's got the attention of all the regulators. It's got the attention of almost everybody. And quite honestly, I didn't think we still had this problem in our industry. So I was saddened to see that it's still an issue that plagues us. So we are so honored to have with us these incredible speakers that are going to be joining us and sharing with us about appraisal bias that is still a problem within our mortgage industry. So we have with us today Amanda Phillips. Amanda has over 2 decades of experience in the financial service industry, including holding executive roles in legal and regulatory compliance. Prior to joining ACES Quality Management, Amanda was with the law firm of Baylor Sparra LLP, where she advised clients on federal and state regulatory requirements governing mortgage lending. So Amanda is clearly well versed in this area. She's going to bring us some very important information that we all want to listen to intently. And I want to encourage all of you to write down whatever questions that you may have on this topic as we go forward, because we will leave a little time at the end for your questions. And the next speaker that we have joining us today is Genail Nemovi. Okay, Genail, help me here. I always Nemovi.
Like Finding Nemo and then a VI at the end, Nemovi.
That's right. You told me that. Nemovi. Thank you. Well, she is the president of her own law firm and the firm's managing attorney. She has successfully represented financial institutions, government agencies, private investors, asset managers, and related industry clients in commercial and real estate and mortgage matters in California for over 16 years. She is frequently a speaker at our numerous industry-related events on enforcement and security interests and regulatory compliance. So once again, we have an attorney here that's well versed in this space. And so you can ask whatever questions you have of Genail and the other panelists. And we round out this wonderful speaking panel with Michelle Bailey Rogers. Michelle has been a residential appraiser since 1992. Michelle's 18 years in the field working directly for American Savings Bank, Washington Mutual Bank, and CoreLogic. Michelle also completed research with the principals at Bell, Anderson, and Sanders, specializing in damaged real estate valuations. In 2010, she joined the Fannie Mae Forensic Review Team at Interthink under the direction of Vicki Gill, CRA. Michelle is now currently Chief Valuation Officer at New American Funding for the last 9 years. And with her current position, she works on a daily basis in accordance with the regulations of Fannie Mae, FHA, and additional investors for the purpose of rep and warrant valuations. We have our own appraiser here, y'all, okay? It's been a long time since we've enjoyed an appraiser on our panel. So we are so happy to have Michelle here with her expertise in this space. And so at this point, I just want to turn this over to our panelists. Everyone listen intently, write down your questions. We're going to have an engaging conversation this morning. Ladies, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. And a quick thank you to Prime Lending for sponsoring the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. We skipped over that. There we go. Thanks, Samantha. Definitely wanted to give them their credit where credit is due. So first, before we get into like what the heck we're all going to do with all of this, we're going to just sort of chat amongst the three of us and you guys about sort of the regulatory history around how we got where we are. Next slide. So as Rosalind so eloquently mentioned, this really is being championed and started. We can go all the way back to January 2021, when we got a very early executive order on the 20th of January from the Biden administration, and it was entitled Executive Order on Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Understanding Communities through the Federal Government. Now, the key quote that I took from this EO, and I've used it over and over again, is affirmatively advancing equity, civil rights, racial justice, and equity opportunity is the responsibility of the whole of our government. So way back at the beginning of the administration, it was clear that this whole of government approach was going to be sort of a string through the approach of the administration to equity issues. And, you know, none of us knew exactly where it was going at the time, but this was sort of the first crumb to be put on the path, so to speak. Next slide. So then pretty quickly thereafter, June of 2021, the Biden administration created a task force. It's called the Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, or PAVE. This was created June 1st of 2021, and the directive was to evaluate the causes, extent, and consequences of appraisal bias, and to establish a transformative set of recommendations to root out racial and ethnic bias in home valuation. So when this task force was created, it got my attention. It was sort of the first time that appraisal bias sort of bubbled to the top of all the other issues we'd been hearing about fair lending and other things that were going to happen, but appraisal bias, this really got my attention. I don't know about you ladies when this came out.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was really stark when you see the press interview they had with Kamala Harris, you know, where they had that the first, I guess, couple or family that was affected, that they wanted to make sure they spotlighted. They had a difference in the appraisal on their home of about $500,000. It was undervalued by $500,000, which was stark. And so they put a lot of emphasis on that in behind the reason and the need for this type of task force, and that something must be done, realizing that home ownership is the it's going to be the main indicator of wealth for most individuals, and that valuation can be very impactful on how they grow their wealth over time. So definitely something that we all took notice of, and it was the start of something big, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Samantha, if we want to go to the next slide, the administration definitely got the regulators' attention when they created their task force as well. So we start to see the CFPB publishing their blog posts, and I'm sure we've all read them and everything. I'm just sort of highlighting the timeline. July 2nd, so it took them 1 month after the task force was created for the Bureau to put out their first blog post, and it said the CFPB is prioritizing resources against racial bias in home appraisals. So, okay, now it's on the CFPB's radar too, and we all know that if it gets the CFPB's attention, it's going to spread across the government for sure. Next slide. So then in the fall, this was a little bit more broad than just appraisal, but we see the DOJ announces its redlining initiative. This is October of 2021. So we're about a year ago, almost exactly, 2 days, we're almost into this. It was the DOJ when they announced the initiative, along with the CFPB, OCC, and the U.S. Attorney's Office that made the announcement. And at the time, the CFPB really announced its focus on something that I think was sort of new to everybody's ears. They talked about digital redlining, and they specifically called it out in the context of advertising, and then the use of artificial intelligence and other algorithmic decisioning tools in connection with underwriting and property valuation. So that immediately made me think about AUS, but also AVMs. Right? What algorithms go into AVMs, and how is the Bureau looking at this? And they didn't go into a ton of detail at the announcement of the DOJ redlining initiative, but it definitely made my ears perk up.
Yeah, and just to carry that forward, I just caught wind of the CFPB they had mentioned, or the CFPB, or it was the White House, the Office of Science and Technology, they developed this AI Bill of Rights models that can be used. That they just released it at the beginning of this month. And when I was reviewing that, there's mixed reviews on how effective it will be, but I think it includes 5 principles around safe and effective systems, algorithmic discrimination protections, data privacy, notice and explanation, as well as human alternatives, consideration, and fallback. And so if nothing else, the positive feedback would be that it provides a sort of intellectual foundation that kind of sets the tone for what lenders or companies that use this. But in our situation, we're looking at lenders and kind of giving that guidelines of what you should be looking for when you take on or onboard an AVM model.
Yeah, so it's really going to beef up vendor due diligence requirements, right? We already have those vendor due diligence requirements. You should be making sure that your vendors have proper procedures in place depending on the service they're providing. But I think nobody really thought about diving that deep on a tech vendor to say, we want to know more about your algorithm and how do you build your algorithm and how can you prove to me that there's not bias in that? Next slide, Samantha. So then fast forward just a little bit, it's just been this constant drip of stuff coming out. In February of 2022, there was a joint comment letter that was sent to the Appraisal Foundation regarding supported conclusions related to prohibited characteristics. And you can see here, it's like every federal regulator you can think of that would have an interest in the Appraisal Foundation. And it's specifically, the letter was in reaction to a board ethics rule advisory opinion stating that the provisions didn't prohibit an appraiser from relying on supported conclusions, suggesting that reliance may be permissible. And so they sort of gave a whole read act down to the Appraisal Foundation related to the Fair Housing Act and COA. I'm curious, Michelle, I'm sure that this letter got your attention back then, if you had any thoughts on it.
As an ultimate appraiser in the field is kind of where I come from. Wrapping your head around all of this, the AI intelligence, it's hard. So when you put this together with, everything they're trying to make sure we don't have a bias. So the letter was very important because it put together a lot of different paths that we were kind of trying to take to come up with a valuation.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely, probably, appraisers seeing this letter, I'm sure it was a little bit of a shock to the system and a surprise for them. They're not used to hearing from all these federal agencies around the work that they do.
Yeah, honestly, probably never really paid attention until now, to be honest with you. Most of them in the field, they just do their job, and provide evaluation.
Absolutely, totally. And the same month, on the next slide, Samantha, the CFPB blogs again, right? Their blog posts are their new thing. It's sort of cracking me up. But February 4th, they put out a blog, and the title of it was "Appraisal Discrimination is Illegal Under Federal Law." I remember when the email came in, and they always put the title of their blog post in the subject line, and it definitely got my attention when it hit my email box. But then I went and read the blog post, and it talks about they're concerned that appraisers may be unaware of federal discrimination bans, and it urges the Appraisal Foundation to provide clear guidance on existing legal standards. It went on to say how they are deeply troubled by discriminatory statements the FHFA had identified in some home appraisals and the appraisal disparities in communities of borrowers of color recently found by both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac studies. So to me, the Bureau was, by February of this year, really sort of ramping up its activity and rhetoric. Even its language started getting more aggressive, around the topic of appraisal bias, and you can tell they're not going to let go of it. They're keeping it in their blog posts, and while they haven't taken any specific action, such as rulemaking or anything, you can see that they're discussing it with other federal agencies. The intergovernment communication is ongoing. Everybody is talking at this point. So, you know, it keeps going. They drop more hints. They make some comments. Same month, the CFPB makes comments in connection with the release of their outline for rulemaking for AVM control standards. Total side topic. This is a Dodd-Frank rule that's required. And we should be expecting it before the end of the year. It's got to come out, they said in their rulemaking agenda in December. But their specific comments were very interesting. Just one quote here I have says, computer models and algorithms are additional tools for mortgage lenders to improve valuation accuracy. So here we go back to the digital appraisal issue, right? However, automated valuation models can pose fair lending risks to home buyers and homeowners. The CFPB is particularly concerned without proper safeguards. Flawed versions of these models could digitally redline certain neighborhoods and further embed and perpetuate historical lending, wealth, and home value disparities. So they're back to the AVM issue, and this is all in connection with the AVM rule that we can expect to be coming out this year. Genail, did you have anything else to add on this one?
Well, I mean, I think when I sit and just kind of take that 50,000-foot overview over, you know, like what when I'm struggling with this issue, right? I mean, they're making a big deal about it. It seems if it's happening, it's horrible, but there's very strong opinions on both sides of the issue of what's going on. But I think that, you know, if you just take a step back and look at it, you see that, you know, whether it's a few bad apples, a few bad appraisals, or a more systemic problem, the documentation that and the reports and the research that have come out has shown that there is a clear difference, a very significant difference of, in the gap of the valuation of homes of minorities, specifically Black and Brown people, versus those in the areas of white neighborhoods. And I think that when you look at that and you scratch the surface and you see that, then you have to try to figure out why that's happening. And whether it's the bad appraisals based on bias, you know, I think when you look at bias, you have to look at appraisal bias, you have to look at both conscious and unconscious bias. And, you know, and a lot of it, so in other words, it could be happening and it could be prevalent. I mean, when you look at the rules don't really, even the laws, it prohibits discrimination, right? Discrimination. If you don't know that you have this unconscious bias that you're putting on top of things, how can you say, you know, that you're not consciously discriminating, but there's a subconscious undertone there that may be coming out into an appraisal? And when you look at the makeup of the demographics of our appraisal industry, of appraisal, there's, you know, it's in large part, and we're going to look at that in a little bit, but I mean, it's in large part older white males. And so I think that whenever you take this approach of just, you know, primarily have one group dictating something as significant as valuation of real property, and then, you know, there are going to be problems. There are things that could be vetted out and level set if you diversify, right? So if there's diversity that's there, that's my kind of belief and view in a lot of situations, that it should mimic what the community looks like, that in terms of companies, regulators, and such. And so we have to kind of look at it from that viewpoint. That's my viewpoint. And so when I'm looking at these and what's happening, I'm trying to take the good away from it. And what I see in the areas of opportunity is really to diversify our appraisal pool.
That's actually a perfect lead into our next slide, because I completely agree with you. In March of this year, we finally got the PAVE action plan. And it is not a report. You can see right here, they're very clear. They said this document is intended as an action plan. It's not a report. It's not to be put on a shelf to, collect dust like so many, government reports or even corporate reports. Gosh, I've worked lots of places where we develop lots of reports and then they go sit somewhere and nobody does anything with them, right? But in the action plan, they talk about lots of things, updating GSE appraisal specific policies and guidance, which is why I think we're expecting something from Fannie and Freddie very soon. But they also talk about developing new structures to the industry to improve transparency and public participation. They talk about recruiting diverse appraisers in the action plan, and the industry itself, right, making changes. I think those are probably slow to come. Unfortunately, it's hard. It's going to be hard to do, but that's what I am of the opinion as well, that we should be doing those things. And they said going forward, they're also going to assess, and I thought some of these were very interesting, and I think it'll feed into our conversation around like, what do we do, right? What do we do with all of this information? They talked about they're going to look at the expanded use of alternatives to traditional appraisals, as well as potentially using ranges of value instead of a single estimated value to try to reduce the impact of bias. I don't know how ranges would play out in secondary market. I still haven't wrapped my brain around how we would handle that and how the industry would sort of adopt it, but I think I found it very, very interesting. And then they also talked about public sharing of historical appraisal data, which I think would be fascinating if they found a way to like create some depository for historical appraisals that would then be publicly available.
I would be interested to hear Michelle's thoughts on that.
Yeah,
coming
absolutely.
with her appraisal background.
Gosh, there's so much, right? I mean, starting from data. Let's go with the data. So you're taking in data, but you're taking the data in appraisers who are giving their opinion, okay? And you're making it into a number. The GSEs have all regulated, they've made it very clear how we lay out our appraisals, for instance, how we call a house. All written out in there, and they're redoing the format. So we will be getting in better data. But again, it's an opinion. So when you start to talk about, my opinion of this house versus this guy's house, we have rules and regulations to follow. But that's kind of a lot of times when you're talking about data and sharing data, because you may not really have a good, you might not have your thumb on the right place to share it. So I have a tough time with the sharing data because it's an opinion, and my opinion may not be the same as the next guy. That makes sense. Next appraiser. Now, going back to appraisers and the industry, if you can imagine, yes, most of the appraisers are, white older men in their 60s, about 55% or somewhere around there. That's because that's what's been growing. I got in the industry 30 years ago, and I was clearly the only woman showing up at somebody's door because they thought I was going to be the secretary rather than showing up at their door. So that takes a little time to change. Now we're getting in pools from colleges and people that actually want to appraise, which is great, but there's a lot of education to be had in order to become an. So there's a lot of layers of trying to find that right mix of people to bring in the industry. I think we're doing a great job where every state is responsible for their own education and what they require, and it's based off of the federal guideline. But I think we're honing it in a little better to where it's a little more conducive to a college student, because they want to make some money when they come out the door and not work for free for 2,000 hours, basically. So, and banks are now finally getting back into bank appraising. So that's kind of cool because that's how I came in. I was a bank appraiser. I learned higher ups, and that was the best training because I was in there. So again, the PAVE is great, and it's bringing in lots of different pieces of the pie. And I love that part, that we can hopefully take little pieces here and there and make it better, you know. So, and artificial intelligence, I don't know. That's a whole nother ball of wax, you know. I think it's great for some or certain entities, or, you know, but I don't know if it fits into every group. And that's also the problem, that you got to figure out what it works for. And, you know, really value the same thing. That's always going to talk, that's been talked about for years. I don't think it will happen. To be honest with you, I don't get why they want to do ranges of value, which makes a ton of sense. So I'm coming from the lender side, that kind of, you know, everything has to fit in a box, right? So that's the problem with the lending side, is it's got to fit in everybody's box or it doesn't work, you know. So being open to ranges of value would be more of a, you know.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's the ranges of value thing, like fitting it in a box, especially with lenders. I think about, you know, back when I was at a lender, back when I was a loan processor, how would we have possibly handled ranges of value? Like, it's going to be very interesting to see if we can wedge that in, or if it's really anything that gets any traction. I have no idea. I'm waiting and watching on that one. Next slide, real quick, Samantha. Just as you know, Fannie and Freddie, they've said that we can expect guidance from them this fall. I actually heard that in person live in May. It's almost Halloween. I'm still waiting to hear something from them. But recently at a Housing Wire annual event, I saw that the FHFA director stated that they're looking at hybrid appraisals and other alternatives so they can really try to address some of the bias. Just sort of a preview of what we may see from Fannie and Freddie. I think we're waiting to hear from them still. We're
already piloting hybrids. We've been piloting hybrids for a little while now. I would say probably pre-COVID when we started piloting a type of a hybrid. But it's been in the works, and this is just launched it, you know. Hybrid, because it makes sense when you're talking about any kind of bias. You know, one person shows up at the house, say for instance, does all the, you know, work, you know, they get this floor plan photos, and then another person at a desk would bring the valuation based on this information. Does that make sense? And that way you've got one person just gathering basic information, and this person, you know, bringing it to the forefront with the valuation piece. So I think it's a great thought process, and it's definitely working. It worked during COVID. We had to go to desktops during COVID because appraisers couldn't go in houses for a long time. So there was, you know, we're learning as we go, and it's been a good thing. I mean, I think it's important that, you know, from the bias perspective, that's probably one of the best things they could be doing right now. Not everybody's on board with it because it's a little clunky right now, I'll be honest, but we're getting there. So,
Michelle, can I ask what in the group that goes out to and actually visits the property, and the group that stays in and actually does the write-up, are both groups licensed appraisers, or is there some level for the person that goes out there, lesser level for the person that goes out there to the property?
Property inspectors. So what they're calling them are property inspectors. And then some of us, I use appraisers, 2 different appraisers. We also have property inspectors. So it just depends on the vendor that's providing the service, what exactly, and then, you know, if the lender agrees, I like this, and then another lender's going to like it. But what is interesting is they've got pretty much, like, I'm going to call it a checklist of things they provide. So it's all the same information. And that appraiser or inspector, they're not bringing anything to the table regarding value. They're just complete inspectors. So if you can imagine, then all that data gets valuation back at the desk.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. I think, because ultimately the goal is, regardless, is to have a true value, right? That's what we want, is the true value. And I think some of the criticism that's out there is that, when you try to split it up that way and you don't have a licensed appraiser out doing the work, the initial work, that there could be some implications there that you don't get the good information in. But if everything is forms, this is, checkbox, this is the information, it's very objective, then there's probably little by way of any type of, you don't need too much education or to be licensed necessarily to get that information across.
And in the beta testing, Fannie, we did with Fannie for different products, they took the information and reviewed it first before they would even allow, so there's been that process that they're making sure they're nailing all the right checkboxes, and all the information. And I'll be honest, as an appraiser out in the field and been doing it for 30 years, it's hard to wrap their head around this, Appraisers like to go out and feel and touch and see the trees and smell the, whatever's going on, and see the street and see the traffic, because there's so much involved in coming up with that value. So tricky place for appraisers that don't know how to take data like that and put an evaluation on it, if that makes sense. I mean, walk out to the street and it's a busy street, so somehow you've got to figure out that that's a busy street. I know those are really basic, but those are the things you're looking at for the evaluation, location, So it's not anything that's going to happen over.
We lost your volume. We lost your audio.
We're having a hard time hearing you, Michelle, right now.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep,
Okay,
you're back.
That's better.
Actually, that's okay. If we want to go to the next slide, we were just going to dive into sort of like, so what do we do? This is where we are. There's a lot of, maybe we'll try this, maybe we'll try that. The hybrid, which I think is fascinating. And I think that it sounds like we're onto something. As clunky as it is, and it's a lot of change, and probably really hard for professional appraisers to adjust and adapt to that. But where do we go from here? So next slide. These are just some bullet point ideas of like things that we were going to talk about. But Genail, we can even go to the next one. We had some statistics on here that you sort of alluded to earlier. There we go.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is what nationwide, this is the demographics of our appraiser pool, right? Which is stark when you look at it. And I think that once you take that look and see what we're dealing with, that we see that there is opportunity definitely in diversifying that pool. And I think that, that's probably the best way to tackle, or the place you're going to see the biggest impact. And of course, it's going to take time to do it, but it's something that, needs to be done. And when you look at even just the ages of the appraisers, 70% over 50, 20% over age 66, I think that the appraisal industry has recognized that as a need to try to attract and recruit talent to their field overall, but we should be, and I think they also recognize that talent needs to be diverse going forward. So I think that there will be some improvement there, but of course it's going to take time, but it's going to take a clear effort on the stakeholders to make that happen. So if it's not just the appraisal industry either, lenders can do things to help out with that. There's a ton of social programs that you can partner up with your AVMs or the Appraisal Institute and ensure to address some of the educational issues or barriers to like that Michelle alluded to, the 2,000 hours that they have to put in and not get paid. That there's something that can be done, maybe pair them up, require the appraisers that are going out to have some type of program in place where they're mentoring, or we can do that. I think lenders can do that on the side of when they're vetting and onboarding as well as having those requirements or looking to see, checking, and inquiring with the AMC if they're using those, or to make sure that that's happening. So, I mean, I think there's things that we can do to help it along, but that's the change that needs to happen, and the focus needs to be there.
Yep, absolutely. If we want to go back just one slide, we can, just start talking through some of the other things that I'm hearing out there. I'm curious if you guys are hearing some of the same things too. I know that we, Genail and I were talking through some of these. So, diversity in your appraiser pool, we've hit on that. I think that that's a key component, right? Whether it's, do you run your own appraisal desk because you're a large enough lender to do that? Are you encouraging and requiring diversity in your appraiser pool to the extent that you can find it right now? How are you partnering up with community resources to change how the makeup of our current appraiser? We have a shortage of appraisers right now, and just based on those demographics that we were looking at, we're potentially facing an even bigger shortage.
Yeah. Well, because this hasn't been addressed for so many years, and I think that's the unfortunate part, and that's why we're seeing that age gap. This has not, and outside the diversity, it's been a problem. So, the same issues, along with diversity. It's been really key. I gotta say, in this last, 2 years or a year, it has really kicked into high gear. I mean, everybody's putting for the Appraisal Institute, the foundations, they're working on stuff. The foundation's working on, changing, stuff, I should say, which is what our ethics code is responsible for. And then again, like we talked about, AMCs that are hiring more diverse, or there's a couple AMCs that they're strictly doing the whole mentor program, which is great. Is it Veros, that group? I can't think of their name right now. The group that's strictly doing appraisers and mentors. And so they came to us and they said, will you take us on as a new vendor because we're doing this program? We're saying yes. So I think that's the way you can do it is you got to build it first, because you can't just jump into the pool, without putting in the water. That's, I'm an appraiser. So.
Absolutely. Some other things that some basic stuff, policies and procedures, like dusting off those policies and procedures, making sure that as part of your compliance management system, that establishing the relationships for a diverse appraiser pool are part of your policies and procedures, and that you're of course following them. But I think also important is during the underwriting process of a loan, appraisal review processes. So Michelle, you talked about the hybrid appraisal up front, but then I think it's also important to have a robust appraisal review process. And what does that look like? I know that some of my clients are doing all kinds of different things, the users of our software. Some have a totally separate group of underwriters that all they do is underwrite appraisals. They don't look at the rest of the file. All they get is the appraisal, and clear escalation processes if they see something that they're not used to seeing. And then of course, value reconsideration policies and procedures, making sure that staff is trained. How do you appeal evaluation if your consumer thinks that the home was not properly valued? Do you have that embedded in your consumer complaint process? Do your loan officers know who's allowed to talk to who and who's not allowed to talk to an appraiser? And how do you get data to give to that appraiser for a reconsideration? These are things that we should already have been doing, but I think dusting them off and taking a fresh look at how we're doing these things is extremely important. Michelle, what are you seeing around sort of the appraisal review and underwriting process right now? What are you hearing?
We've seen a couple different things. I know from my perspective, and when you talk about review and underwriting, that gets pretty trade secrets, right? So I can only kind of speak for ourselves. I don't want to say I know what anybody else is doing. We have some review tools for each of the appraisals that highlight possible wording that could potentially be some bias. And that's, that's a new thing for us. We just kind of brought that on, and we're trying to see how that works. Is it, you know, and maybe put in those potential issues or those potential words that could indicate that there's a problem, you know, and then during your review, like you said, you know, we use the Fannie and Freddie, their review product, you know, that they scrub the appraisals, I mean, the ratings, and it's been helpful because it kind of gives us a balance of something's overvalued or undervalued now. So we can put those in different places and different buckets and have different, you know, high-level reviews. I have my own appraisers that review on my end some of the files that come in from underwriting. So, and again, the ROV process, probably one of the biggest, you know, reconsideration of value process is key. That, you know, it's very concise and it's very laid out on who should be reviewing and what's the escalation process. So you're right. It's the ROV is a big thing, and that's coming, and everybody's reviewing. Should be a very precise program. I mean, policy in place, and that way, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And the CFPB is keen on consumers being able to ask for a reconsideration of value. So something that, you know, has been important since appraiser independence rules came out is still important, or more important today, to take a fresh look at those. Genail, what are you seeing and hearing from your clients?
Well, I mean, that definitely that they have been looking more closely at the complaints that come in and reviewing just appraisals in general, doing that closer review of appraisals and looking for any indicia of bias that there could be, or anything that they can train on, because, you know, they're concerned, they're worried that, you know, it's not just them who are looking either, and so they want to be able to catch and vet out problems before they become errors.
Absolutely. So this last bullet point is something I actually heard from a fair lending legal compliance officer at a very large bank, that they are working on implementing a appraisal review and appraisal data review as part of their fair lending program, and trying to figure out what data points to use and analytics around looking for outliers, just based on almost like HMDA plus data as part of their fair lending program, to try to look for potential trends, particularly, you know, okay, I found 5 outliers in Wells County, Colorado that look like, from a value perspective, they might be out of whack, and they all came from the same appraiser. And trying to do some of that kind of data analytics, which I think is something new and fresh. It's certainly not anything that was part of my fair lending program 10 years ago. But I've heard it from one very large bank. I haven't heard from anyone else that they're starting to do this, but I think it's fascinating. And, you know, potentially another way to try to identify issues that don't get caught in all of the other escalation processes that we potentially have built into our loan origination program. I don't know if either of you have heard of folks doing this or not. Like I said, I heard from one fair lending compliance officer at a very large bank.
That's very interesting, as that would be a lot of data to put together. And I think that, you know, do keep scorecards on appraisal, that you know, and if there's scoring, like I was talking about the scoring a certain way, and maybe there's a way to write that, I can understand that. Again, that's a lot to put in and really sell down.
Yeah, they were just working on developing it, and it was super interesting to hear. They hadn't exactly nailed down, you know, exactly what any of their thresholds would be, what would constitute an outlier, but they were working on compiling the data and integrating it into their full regression analysis as part of their fair lending program. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. With that, did we want to see if there were any questions from our attendees out there?
Absolutely.
I've had a few questions.
Samantha, we can within the webinar, there is a place, I believe, for the attendees to put in questions. Is that correct?
There should be a Q&A dialog box on your control screen. You can go ahead and send in any questions you may have there. Let's see. The first one we received is, within the last 6 months, I have received appraisals performed by out-of-market appraisers using unrealistic comparables to support excessive purchase prices. This poses a concern for me representing the buyers of the loan and an appraisal valuation that is unethical. How do we protect our buyers, sellers, and clients in this market?
Michelle, Michelle, can you help us with that one?
That's a big, like, wow, that's a big treat.
I think that is the question du jour.
Yeah, that's a narrative, personally. I mean, I get that it has, and on top of bias or diversity, I should say, we also have had a crazy market the last 2 years, right? And my job on my side is to make sure that we are providing appropriate valuation for our borrowers and our investors. So yeah, I agree that there's been some crazy stuff out there. And how do you marry realtors, lenders, appraisers? How do you make them all understand that the market's a little crazy and that we got to be careful and not make sure we don't put our borrowers in a bad position? And that's when I see something come across my desk like that, which happens quite often. I say to my loan team, I'm like, listen, we got to watch for this poor borrower. We don't want them to overpay. So I don't know how that can really fall into diversity, to be honest with you. I think that's just a market-driven issue, and it goes up and it goes down. So watch out for our borrowers. My first, it's on the top of my list, is watch out for the borrowers.
Yeah, in addition to appraisal bias, we have appraisal quality that we need to watch out for, right?
That's a whole nother conversation.
Totally. We could do another hour on appraisal quality.
No, it's 2 hours.
Do we have another question out there, Samantha?
There is a lot of diversity amongst loan officers. Does the panel have any thoughts why that does not translate to the appraisal industry?
And I think that we are starting to tackle that issue now. And I don't think that it was available. I don't think it was available, the type of communication, the type of education that we have now. The past 30 years for me has just been like, you take the classes, hopefully you'll find somebody to mentor you. So I think it's opening the doors, and I think loan agents have a totally different, they can go into, like us, we have, the training to become a loan agent, but we can't do the training to be an appraiser. So, I think, not everybody's bringing it up now. It should have been brought up a long time ago. But
barriers to entry for an appraiser to be an appraiser have historically been very high compared to a loan originator.
Right. And is it still, that's what I was hearing recently at some meetings that I was at, and that is that the timeline that it takes for an appraiser to actually get their license and be a working appraiser is quite significant, and it certainly does exceed what the loan officers and other professionals in our industry are required to go through. Is that something that is being looked at, and that is what actually is required to become an appraiser in our industry?
It's being looked at extensively. Yes, every state's is kind of initiating some of their continuing education. There's a lot more continuing education available. Again, there's people like the Appraisal Institute, only because I'm a member. We're putting together some serious programs that we take, an appraiser on from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Never had that before. You've always gotten your education and you're on your own. Now we're putting appraisers together with mentors and following those mentors. And so it is becoming a great process now. I got to say, it's wonderful. And we're finding people in the colleges. This is what we need, right?
Yeah.
We need these people to come out of college and say, hey, this looks like a great, great industry. Let's get involved, so I got to say it's being addressed now. And it can't be done fast enough, right? And so I think it's really right now. It's been a long time.
That's great. What, do you have any others, Samantha?
I do. Hang on one second. I'm trying to pull them up. Some people are. I had an
That's
email
awesome
sent in as
that the
well.
Institute's doing that.
Well,
Michelle. That's so cool.
while they're typing, you got them, Samantha?
I have one, yes.
Go ahead.
Residential appraisals are significantly driven by comparable sales. What are the findings as it pertains to comparable sales used to arrive at the differing valuations for the same property?
The bottom line, my appraiser did it this way, your appraiser did it that way, and that's, you know, that's going to happen. And yeah, the comparables should be that market. And that's a conversation Genail and I were having not too long ago about how, what is your market? I mean, where you live, where I live, this is my market. Why would I use comparables in a different neighborhood? It's pretty simple if you step back and look at it from your own perspective, right? So you have your house. I want a house, comparable down the street. It's super simple, but people are making it a little bit more difficult, and appraisers are going over here to maybe a more high-end neighborhood, and they're coming in with the sales prices for here. So that's where we've got a problem with, hey, we don't want to overvalue, right? We don't want to overvalue a home and then that person not be able to say refinance 6 months after they close because the comparables in their neighborhood don't support their value. So I wish I could answer that a lot easier, but comparables do drive. Yes, that's the bottom line.
And the ultimate value is an opinion, right?
Right.
And sometimes you have to get two. Trust me, I won't go into that, but yes, we do need to have two sometimes. And then you have to make the determination which is a better quality, which is right and which one's wrong.
Okay.
Wow.
Samantha, what are the questions?
We have one more. It's a little long, so hang on one second. As an underwriter and collateral analysis reviewer, I see that appraisers often have incorrect data regarding sales, regarding condition, quality, and GLA of sales they may or may not use. Some of this misinformation is due to realtors putting incorrect data on the MLS. This may not lead to bias of the borrower, but market value may be skewed because of incorrect data. Can you respond or aware of similar issues or possibility of improving MLS and public records?
Wow, that's a good question.
Yeah. Well, again, the appraiser's job is to provide an analysis and an opinion. When you analyze in the report, you better tell me why you came up with this as opposed to this. That's happening all the time. Your MLS says this and your property records say this. Well, you tell me why you chose this over this. Again, analysis. And that's the problem is appraisers don't know how to do that, and they don't know how to reconcile the data. So I know I'm getting a little more technical than maybe possible, but that's truly it. And we just currently came out with the ANSI guidelines, and everybody's familiar with that, I'm sure, that's in the industry. And that's all about measuring the house and what's acceptable. And we're trying to page, what's a heated, what's not, what's grade. So, we're trying to hone in everybody right here, but the realtors don't have to follow that, So what do you do with that, right? That's where the MBA gets involved.
Okay. Well, you know what? I appreciate all the participants and the questions that you all have asked. We're coming now to the close of it. I'm not going to get to ask all the 10 zillion questions I wrote down in my notes, so we may have to do this again, but I want to thank you all for coming, each one of you, Genail, Amanda, Michelle, and sharing with us about this appraisal bias. It's a very important topic. It's not going to be something that's easily fixed, but we most certainly must tackle it, because I want to leave everyone on here in thinking about, and I thought about this when it comes to appraisal bias, and that is, how would you feel if there was an inherent bias in appraisers or people that are doing appraisals against families with children? and you found out that this was a problem and values were being affected. So you had to purify your house of all the pictures and everything that indicated you had children, so that they would never say, take away all the toys, do everything, make sure your house shows no evidence of any children, because you don't want your appraisal to be devalued. And so that's what real families are dealing with. You have families that are sanitizing their homes because they are people of color, so that they can see, can they make sure that they are getting the best value that's afforded to their home. And you know your neighbor across the street just got their house appraised, and it got appraised for $200,000 more than what yours is getting appraised for, which does affect. That may have been your child's college tuition that you were counting on, but now you can't get it. We're talking about something that affects people's lives in the real sense of the word. And so I thank you all for coming and sharing this. And I want the industry to stay engaged and knowing that this is an issue that we must fix, we must tackle. And we must continue to talk to the people who are doing the work. We talked about bias. Genail mentioned conscious, unconscious. We're talking about human beings here. So a lot of dialogue needs to be had with the appraisers in the industry and say, hey, we need you to recognize that that can exist. How much leeway would we get if appraisers just woke up to the fact that they could have biases, and to make sure they're looking at their own appraisal reports to ensure that that's not bleeding into it? You could truly tackle a lot of this appraisal bias if those doing the work just saw that. So on that note, I want to thank you all. Those of you that are here, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee is so proud to bring you this session. We will continue to do more. We want to encourage you to go onto the Cal MBA website, where you can go into our committee page and look at all the resources and the other things. We have so many other webinars. We've got podcasts. We're all trying to work this issue about diversity and equity and inclusion into our industry all together. And we're trying to give you all that we have, all the resources we can, all the information we can to help to make everyone successful, so that everyone is treated equally and fairly in this industry. When we're dealing with home financing, we're dealing with people's shelter, we're dealing with people's wealth. And we don't want to forget that these are families, these are people that we're working with here. Thank you, ladies, once again. Thank you, Samantha, for all that you've done. And to the participants, thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.